All right. I hope that worked. Let's see if this works. A new intro. Hey, I got a drum. Okay. Sometimes the intro works, sometimes it doesn't. And I look kind of goofy when I'm dancing and there's no music behind me. But anyway, welcome back. This is Retro Recon. My name is Chris Perry, and I am so glad you're here because today we're going to talk about a very interesting president of the United States. Yes, that's right. This week, school started back. So I got back in front of a classroom, and I'm telling you, that's my element. I absolutely love it. Stand in front of people and talk about history. It's like, I would do it for free. I do get paid to do it, but I would do it for free. I mean, I would, teach history for food if I needed to because I absolutely love it. Talking about history is one of the most joyous things that I can do in my life. Anyway, so this week, one of the things that came up, we were talking about presidents of the United States, and I always make a joke about how, I know how everyone will sit around at night and think about, who is the best presidents ever and rank them, things like that, right? Probably no one but me does this, but from time to time, I'll, list them out and think, this guy did this guy did that, all this kind of stuff. A lot of times people don't talk about maybe the worst presidents. Now, interestingly enough, there is a guy that tends to end up on that list. Now, he's really fun though. Actually, getting into this guy's history and the things that happened to him, some are some terrible things, also very interesting events, and he played a role in some of the most significant things that occur in American history in the 19th century, especially. And that guy's name is Franklin Pierce. Now, I know everybody's like, all right, you're talking about Franklin Pierce. I've been waiting for this, right? He's one of these, like, he's a rock star. Many of you may not even know who Franklin Pierce is, or maybe haven't thought about Franklin Pierce since, you saw his picture on the wall in school, in elementary school or high school, where people will post the pictures of the presidents or something on their wall in their classroom. Maybe you haven't even thought about him even then, right? Well, Franklin Pierce was an interesting guy for a lot of reasons. He was referred to as Handsome Frank because he was arguably one of the more handsome presidents that we've ever had. So there, I mean, already right out of the gate, the dude is Handsome Frank. Well, that's a great name. That sounds like a mobster almost. Handsome Frank is going to come do the hit or something like that, right? Anyway, so Franklin Pierce has an interesting backstory. He actually, he's from New Hampshire. He went to school with Nathaniel Hawthorne. Pretty big deal. Nathaniel Hawthorne actually helped write his candidate profile, his whole thing when he ends up running for president later on. So, I mean, this is kind of a big deal. You have Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the most, famous people in American literature, right? So, all right. So, Handsome Frank gets involved in politics a little early on. Now, what he finds out and what he realizes is he's a really good public speaker. He's great at talking, and he's a good looking guy, and he's very likable. People like him. It's that old, saying, oh man, I think I could have a beer with him kind of thing. So people like him. So he takes to politics. He takes to state politics in New Hampshire. He actually is elected several times locally in New Hampshire. Then he goes on to the national level. He's elected to Congress. He does really well. He's in the Senate, and he ends up leaving the Senate because he needs a break from the whole political landscape. But then a little thing happens called the Mexican War. And this brings a lot of people. There are literally, this is where some of your more famous politicians, generals, going forward in the 19th century into the Civil War and past that, they really cut their teeth on the national stage, so to speak, is during the Mexican War. Now, he fights, he's an officer, he is well respected for the most part, but then there is an incident while he is in the war. He's riding his horse, and according to the story, he kind of falls off the horse during this is leading up to a battle. He falls off the horse kind of tramples him, so he is in bad shape. Now, the rumor comes out that Frank was scared and fainted, so they started referring to him as fainting Frank, right? So this kind of followed him a little bit. This whole idea of cowardice. Some people thought this. I don't. I've read about this, and I don't think there's a lot of validity to it. But this is one of the things that people used against him. This whole fainting Frank idea, right? So Handsome Frank keeps going, and eventually he shows back up around 1852. He shows back up, and he is amazingly elected president. Now, I say that because the Democrats didn't know who to nominate, and he was just there, and he was kind of like, okay, so they end up kind of nominating him. And ironically enough, he ends up running against his commanding general in the Mexican War, Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was running for the Whig Party at that time. Anyway, so Franklin Pierce is a Democrat. He's a Northern Democrat, but Handsome Frank is what they refer to as a dough face, right? Even his handsome face is all flexible and doughy. Now, what does that mean? He's a dough face Democrat, meaning that he supports the Southern Democrats' policies pretty much. And that includes, slavery, states' rights, things along those lines, especially slavery, because that's what we're dealing with during the 1850s, right? This is a big issue. So he is definitely supportive of the Southern Democrats' plot. He's right there with them. He's what they refer to as a doughface. He's elected in 1852. In fact, he takes as his vice president a man named William Rufus King, who is from Alabama. All right, roll tide. So he's from Alabama. He is the only Alabamian to be elected vice president in the history of our country. But William Rufus King has an interesting story to him as well, because he had a long-standing relationship with James Buchanan. Now, if you don't know who James Buchanan is the guy who actually follows Franklin Pierce as president in 1856, leading up to the Civil War. He was the only bachelor president that we've ever had. Now, there's kind of an interesting theory about him. A lot of people thought that James Buchanan was gay. Now, was he or was he not? I mean, it really doesn't matter, but he could have been. It's possible. Now, he did live with William Rufus King for 14 years, I think. They lived together for a very long time. They were considered, people would refer to King as the significant other of James Buchanan at times. Andrew Jackson, who had a way with words, I guess, he would call them Aunt Fancy and Miss Nancy or something like that. That's what he referred to them as. So there is some, I don't know, some stories out there, this, that, and the other, but who knows? I mean, there's no way to really know, and it really doesn't matter in the end anyway. But William Rufus King, that's an interesting side note to him. Now, another thing about William Rufus King is that he was not even in the country when he was sworn in as vice president. He was in Cuba at the time because the climate was supposed to be better. He was sick. He had tuberculosis, and allegedly this would be a better place for him to be, right? So he was in Cuba when he was sworn in. He was dying. Now, which leads to the next part. He's only vice president for a few weeks. He ends up coming back home to Selma, Alabama, where he dies. So he dies in Selma, and Handsome Frank basically continues the next 4 years with no vice president, because there's not really a good way in the Constitution at this time. I mean, there's not really a good process to name the vice president. So he spends his 4 years without a vice president. The pro tem of the Senate basically is a de facto vice president, sort of, and next in line for the presidency is kind of how they set it up. Now it's a really fascinating thing, because I mean, if you study U.S. history, you see this, because they kind of do things on the fly a lot of times. They will have things happen, and then they just like, well, there wasn't anything written to, tell us how to fix this, so we're going to have to fix it. And this is one of those times. So, it kind of is what it is. But Franklin Pierce did not have a vice president for basically his entire term as president. Now, Pierce was he starts off kind of on a really bad foot personally, because he already had three children. All three died very young. Now, the last of which actually dies on the way on a train ride to Washington. They're on the way to Washington for Pierce to start his term as president, and there's a train crash that kills his last son. He's 11 years old, and he is killed tragically in this train crash on the way to the White House. I mean, it's just a terrible thing. And actually, Pierce's wife was so depressed. No one saw her in public for the next 2 years. She was that. I mean, and as you would, if your last remaining child, and all three had died young, and the last one dies in a train crash, it's just a horrible idea. And Franklin Pierce also he goes from being this really affable kind of guy who is, kind of out there and people really like to talk to. He'll talk to you, to being sort of really, depressed. He starts drinking a lot. He's like a full blown alcoholic while he's president. There's no doubt about that. So he has some issues to deal with, but he's got to be president now, right? At a very vital time in our country. Now, I should also mention that as Handsome Frank is normally mentioned as some of the worst presidents, he's actually sandwiched between two other guys who tend to come up anytime you want to rank the worst of them, and that's Millard Fillmore and the aforementioned James Buchanan, right, who comes right after him. So those two guys are also always brought up as some of the worst. So he's right in the middle. Now, so what did Franklin Pierce do? Did he do anything interesting while he was president of the United States? Well, yes, he did. There are a few things. Now, I will say, in 1854, 1854 is an important year because Pierce is involved in, there's a lot of things that are going to happen in 1854 that are going to lead to what's going to end up happening in 1860, which is the American Civil War. Now, 1854, he signs off on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it reverses the Missouri Compromise. Basically, the Missouri Compromise, and you have the Compromise of 1850 thrown in there a little bit later, these things, all this stuff. But the idea is that no new territories will have slavery, right? So any new territories that come into the United States, slavery is supposed to be forbidden. Okay. Now, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is change that. The Kansas-Nebraska Act says that any new territories that come into the Union will now have the opportunity by popular sovereignty to vote for whether or not they want to have slavery or not. So basically, they leave that up to the people. So the people will decide whether or not to have slavery. So this opens up for people who support slavery a huge, this is opportunity for them. So you start to see other things pop up at this time as well, like the Gadsden Purchase. The Gadsden Purchase basically brings in part of Arizona and New Mexico into the United States. So you have Arizona, part of New Mexico that come into the United States as new territories. So that opens that up for a potential to be slave-holding areas. Then you have something else that pops up in 1854, the Ostend Manifesto. And this is an idea, of course, supported by Pierce, that would bring Cuba into the United States. We were going to annex Cuba, and they wanted to bring Cuba in as a slave state. So that was the idea. So these three things are happening, while he is president, right? Okay, now, so all this is going on, and in the middle of this, I have to say this. All right, so Franklin Pierce becomes, and this is, crazy to think about today, but he becomes the only president of the United States that was arrested while he was in office, right? And you got to think about this. This is a guy who, when he was sworn in to be president of the United States, that he did not want to be sworn in on the Bible. He wanted to be sworn in on a law book. Him and John Quincy Adams are the only two that I'm aware of that used basically a book of law, right? A law book to swear in on instead of the Bible. right? Anyway, so this is a law and order kind of guy, right? Is the idea. So what did Franklin Pierce do to get arrested? Well, he got all liquored up. He got drunk and started to ride a horse in Washington and ran over a woman. That's exactly what he did. So literally, Franklin Pierce gets drunk, hops on a horse, and wants to go for a joyride. And he rides through Washington and just plows over this woman, just runs over her, hurts her. She's hurt. She doesn't die, but she's hurt. And so Pierce is then, the police show up and they arrest Pierce. Well, then, as they're in the middle of this, they find out, well, wait a minute, who is this guy? This guy's the president of the United States. So then they kind of think, well, we should probably let him go. And they do. They let Pierce go. So they don't charge him. No charges are ever brought. Nothing's ever filed, like ever, even though there is pretty good evidence that he was, as they say, drunker than a bicycle, so to speak. I mean, so the whole thing is like, okay, this guy got away with that, right? Driving this horse, riding this horse, which would be like driving a car today, and running over somebody. So this would have been, DUI assault, right? And for 1850s. Anyway, but they never charged Franklin Pierce. And I hate it for the lady. You can almost understand why that he, because he had his 3 kids that had died, the last one tragically. I mean, you can sort of understand how he ends up in this, the position that he is in. So it's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, so that was a unique thing that happened to Pierce, is that he was the only president that was arrested. I mean, it didn't last for long. They let him go, but he was arrested. Now, one of the most interesting things that I will say that Franklin Pierce did, and this one is just absolutely fascinating to me. It happened in 1856. This was getting toward the end of his term. And in 1856, Franklin Pierce passed what is called the Guano Islands Act, or Guano Island Act. You're like, what the heck is this, right? Well, what this is it allows U.S. citizens to claim bird poop. Yes, because that's what guano is, bird poop. I normally refer to it as bat poop, guano loco, that whole thing. If you're in, anyway, you get it. But the point is that what he did was these unoccupied islands, right, that had this guano, he would allow for any U.S. citizens or the United States in general to go in and claim these areas and take them for their own and just claim the bird. Now, why would you want bird poop? Well, it was referred to as white gold back then. It was the greatest fertilizer that you could possibly have. And this was huge for agriculture in the United States. So actually, this was a coup for, people loved this, that we got, guano. Heck yeah. Let's go get that, bird poop and bring it back home, right? Put it in a bag. Let's go. This was huge for, and Pierce thought this was a great, next step in his journey as president of the United States, right? This was going to be a big deal for him, because everything hadn't exactly worked out great for him up to that point. I mean, he had done some things, but nothing like, that just sort of off the chart kind of stuff, right? So it was a very interesting thing. Now, so Pierce then is looking forward to the next election, 1856, right? So he just assumes they're going to nominate him again, but they don't. The Democratic Party is actually like, we're kind of done with you, man. You didn't really do the things we wanted you to do. People looked at his presidency as an absolute failure. So they didn't nominate him. His own party didn't nominate him again. So, Handsome Frank is on the outs. That's going to be the end of that. And of course, the next guy, who I've mentioned a few times in this, interesting guy all on his own, James Buchanan, who, again, some people believe to be our first gay president. Now, whether he was or not, I don't know, but there are people out there that say that. People that I respect as historians, namely Eric Foner is one. He's kind of like the Kendrick Lamar of historians. So he tends to think that's not true. I don't know if it is or not. It really doesn't matter, but that's something that people talk about. So anyway, so there you go. People like, sensational things, I guess. But anyway, so Franklin Pierce not nominated again by his own party, so he's got to, he got to go back home. He actually spends some time with Nathaniel Hawthorne, his old friend. He does that. He keeps drinking. The man drinks himself to death. Really, is what happens. He ends up dying of cirrhosis of the liver because of alcohol abuse for so long. I mean, it's a pretty terrible thing that happens to Franklin Pierce as far as that goes, and the tragedy that this guy had to deal with. Because I mean, he had potential. He's one of those people that I mean, as far as being a president or being someone like a politician who knows how to play the game and get things done. Now, I don't, what he would have got done outside of what he did if his son would have lived, and maybe he wouldn't have been as depressed or been as much of a drinker. I don't know if it would have been that helpful for the United States or not. But he never really had the chance to do it because of life happens, and that's kind of what happened to poor Franklin Pierce. But it is a very interesting thing when you look into these guys, any of them, right? This is why history is so fun, because any of these guys that you look into, you will see that, hey, there's this story behind. I mean, you can go through each one of these guys, and they're all like, there's always something there that you're like, wait a minute, so that is the story of Handsome Frank. He couldn't ride a horse. Clearly, he had two horse-related incidents where he fainted on one and ran over some poor woman while he was riding the other. Likely, he was intoxicated. I wonder if they did field sobriety tests back then, or they just knew. That was. I wonder if they made them like touch their nose or any of that stuff. I don't know, but they probably didn't. But he didn't stay arrested. They never filed any charges on that. Well, that was that. He did have some significant things. The Kansas-Nebraska Act will lead directly to the Civil War because the issues with slavery and the expansion of slavery. So there you have that. So there you go. That's the story of Franklin Pierce. Now, I know that everyone, ranks their presidents, good and bad. So keep doing that. It's kind of fun to look at and do yours. I always, of course, my number one guy is the GOAT. No, Abraham Lincoln. He's the guy, right? And the main reason I choose Lincoln is not because of how he started, but how he ended. Because he as president, he grew, right, intellectually, morally, all that good stuff. So that's really normally why I choose Lincoln. Plus, he got us through the Civil War, which was a big deal. Anyway, all right. So you may have a different number one. Who knows? But that's the story of Handsome Frank, Guano, and drunk driving a horse. So I hope you enjoyed this one today, and have a great rest of your day. See you next time.